Hi, I'm Phil Cooke, and on today's podcast, we're going to be interviewing David Burkus. He wrote the book, The Myths of Creativity, which is a fantastic book. You can see I've got it all marked up here. And today we're going to have a great conversation about the wrong things people have in mind about creativity, the way they think incorrectly, the things that throw them off. And it may be you are suffering from understanding some of these myths and not knowing the truth about how to be creative. So I love creativity. As you know, I've written a book called Ideas on a Deadline, How to Be Creative When the Clock is Ticking. And a lot of that stuff, a lot of those ideas I got from David. He's been a great friend. He's a great speaker, a business consultant, leadership consultant, and we're going to have a terrific time. So stay tuned. So David, I'm thrilled that you're on. Thank you so much for being a part of this. We've known each other for a number of years, but we've kind of been passing in the night. You know, we've taught at a couple places together. We've spoken at a couple conferences together, but I've always admired your focus because it's so amazing. In fact, I have to confess, I ripped you off a little bit when from your book, The Myths of Creativity, when I wrote mine, Ideas on a Deadline, some of these myths are so powerful that I had to talk a little bit about those guys, but at least I recommended your book at the end. So that's a good thing.
No, thank you. And that's fine. You know what? I'm not the first one that used myths around creativity and that concept. I can tell you because I credit him, was a guy named Scott Burkin. We both took the idea from a guy named Bob Sutton, who actually Sutton has this thing he calls Sutton's Law, which is if you think you've had an original idea, you're wrong. In fact, I'm not even the first person to have said this. Like that's the full law, right? So
that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Well, let's start. Well, first of all, tell me a little bit about you. What are you doing today? What did where have you, tell me a little bit about your journey to get here. I know you're consulting, you're speaking at major conferences and events around the country. Bring our viewers up to date a little bit about your career.
Yeah. So the short version of it, I'm an organizational psychologist by training, was a business school professor at our mutual alma mater for almost a decade. But as I was there, I was writing more for a practitioner audience than an academic audience. That's just sort of always what I wanted to do. And so I had two books that while I was still there at the university, and now two more after that. As those were starting to get published, I was getting invitations to speak and work with organizations and write for various places. And eventually, you get to the point where, I don't know, you're probably in a similar boat. There's something about that freedom that you're like, yeah, let's take a shot at this. I took that shot like right before the world ended. So it wasn't a very well-timed shot to go fully independent. But now it's coming back together. So yeah, the old academic in me, I like to do almost everything from an evidence-based, looking at the research in psychology and neuroscience and that sort of thing. But as I always try and say, I'm trying to get good ideas out of the ivory tower and bring them into the corner office or the co-working space or the second bedroom, wherever work gets done these days.
I've never understood academic writing. When I had to do my doctoral dissertation, I wanted to kill myself. I actually thought, well, maybe I'll do it. I'll do the dissertation and maybe later turn it into a book. And it was so academic, I got an A, but there was no way I could translate that into a book. So I totally get the practitioner thing. I don't know how academic writing got into its own little language, but it's just an amazing where it's gone. Just amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really weird world where before maybe 20 years ago, you were writing for even the most notable papers. A couple hundred people in the academic community would read them, right? Yes. Then there was sort of the TEDification of science, where if you had a really interesting finding, maybe TED would put you on stage and have a video that gets viewed by millions of people, and that might make it into the practitioner space. But that was still like a huge gatekeeper. And I remember doing a workshop at Academy of Management, which is the academic association for management professors. And the whole workshop was me and a couple other people who'd been in the practitioner space. And it was essentially how to get your research into that practitioner realm. And the question so many of them kept coming up with was like, well, how do I get newspapers to write about my work? And in my mind, I kept being like, you're missing the point. The point is you do it. The point is you do the research and then you translate it over into the practitioner world, because you're the only one that's going to do it. Otherwise, you're sitting around waiting to get a call from TED, and they're probably not going to call.
Probably not going to call. That is so true. That is so true. Okay. Well, let's jump into this because, I really, your book, The Myths of Creativity, just made a huge impact on me. And I just think it's fantastic and everybody needs to read it. But I want to talk to you about some specific myths that I really have latched onto over the years. One is brainstorming. In my experience, the guy that pushes for brainstorming the most is the guy that's going to have the least ideas. And I think he or she thinks if I can get a bunch of people into a room, we'll come up with something really good. But in my experience, study after study indicates we'll come up with better ideas individually than you will in a group. I think there's a time to bring everybody together. We certainly do that at our team at Cooke Media Group. But the idea that just getting a bunch of people in the room, tossing an idea out or a subject out and expecting great ideas is just a myth. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, you hit it on twofold, right? What I call the brainstorming myth is the myth that all it takes for creativity is brainstorming, right? Yes. And so many businesses are this way. We run into a problem. So we grab a whiteboard marker and we move to a conference room and we just start spitballing stuff. And then about an hour in, somebody circles one and then we go with it. And then it doesn't work. And 3 weeks later, we're back in the same break room spitballing ideas, right? Creativity is a process, right? You might think of it as, to use the fancy academic terms, it's a process of both divergent thinking and convergent thinking. So there is time to blue sky and come up with all sorts of different ideas, but you also need convergent thinking where you're bringing different ideas together, arriving at combinations, and sometimes just better understanding the problem. You look at any, including Alex Osborne, the creator, the person who coined the term brainstorming, you look at the process they use, and it usually starts with understanding the problem first. You've got to know what question we're actually trying to solve. And so many organizations, honestly, they're trying to solve a symptom instead of the actual problem. So that might be a totally different structured activity. That might be research. That might be a number of different things. And then you might be able to go into that divergent thinking. You could be brainstorming. You could use a different technique. What you hinted at is a really solid one, which is there's a lot of research that suggests having people come up with ideas individually on their own and then come to the meeting to discuss the ideas they came up with. That actually usually generates more and better ideas. Right? But then there's still a process of not narrowing it down to one, but testing 3 or 4 ideas, prototyping them, learning from the feedback you get from that, and constantly refining. Sometimes you do a prototype and that just helps you better understand the question. And now you might feel like you're back at the beginning of the process, but you're really not, because you have so much more information, right? So brainstorming is not the know-all, end-all, be-all of creativity, but in so many organizations I work with, that's what it is. We run into a problem. We do no research on whether or not it's a symptom. We jump into a room. We start throwing out ideas. Usually the loudest, and I'll be honest with you, it generally skews male. The loudest and most boisterous people dominate that conversation, while other more introverted people's ideas don't get heard. And then we just pick one, or often pick the one that an individual leader wanted to do anyway.
That's so good. And I've been to a million meetings where the quiet, girl or guy in the corner was the smartest person in the room, but they're overwhelmed by these loud folks, these loud voices that are constantly throwing out ideas. And I'm the same way. I can't focus when people are shouting out ideas. I need to be by myself. And I think that's a factor too. We live in this distracted world, and we just really lost the ability to shut the door and focus on something. So I just think you're so right. You trust me, you could proclaim this message to corporate organizations for the rest of your life, because I think they're obsessed with the whiteboard. I totally agree.
Or it's the Post-it notes thing, right? Something about the multicolored Post-it notes makes us feel like we're being creative, but in reality, like we're in grade 1 of creativity. Yeah.
I even, in my book, I even go so far as to say, stop having the meeting in the conference room. When you do get the team together, have the meeting where the problem lives. If the problem is in the factory, go there. If the problem's in the parking lot, go there. Very often you get ideas will be triggered just being in the environment where the problem is. So there's so many little tweaks to that. I think they're so important. All right, let's go to another one. Another one is the myth of breeding, the breed myth that you call it in the book, which is essentially some of us are born creative and some of us aren't. Tell me about that.
Yeah, and this is probably the most prevalent of all of them. Not the most dangerous, but the most prevalent of all of them. Because I'm sure you've run into it. Somebody will just say, "Oh, I'm just not very creative," or "Oh, I'm not." But I mean, here's the thing: I have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old at home. They live with me, thankfully. And they're some of the most creative kids I've ever met. And when they were in kindergarten, they were incredibly creative. And in fact, if you look at the research on this, a gentleman by the name of Paul Torrance was one of the original researchers of creativity in kids. He finds that somewhere around fourth grade, there's in the Western system of education, there's a drop off in creativity. And that's usually the grade where we're not talking about like learn your colors and learn your shapes. Now it's remember your facts, right? And we're going to teach you how to do long division and all of these things you have to remember. And what tends to happen is that people get out of practice. Everyone's actually, if you want to say, the breed myth isn't that only some people are born creative and some people aren't. The truth is that everyone is. Some of us just fall out of practice. And it's weird to me because we see the same thing in so many other fields where there's not a natural genetic code for it. It's just, are you well practiced in it or are you not? And yet on creativity, we sort of give ourselves a pass. The only ones that sort of that make it are often, if you think about a school system, are often the ones that fell in love with maybe music or maybe visual art or film or something where, and usually went to a school where someone kind of rescued them and gave them solace in that field and say, you can still be creative here, et cetera. So they stay in practice, right? Either that or it's someone who's gone through a lot of training to kind of unlearn all of that stuff. And I know this is true because we've looked at it from a variety of different fields. We've done studies around genetics, like twins separated at birth. We've done studies trying to correlate personality to creativity, et cetera. And almost none of them have found anything promising. Literally, the only thing you could say that would be remotely connected to a sense of being born creative is there's a personality trait called openness to experience. Some people are born more open to new experiences than others.
I believe that. Yeah.
And that has a small correlation to creativity. But even that one is actually just because if you're more open to experiences, you're going to have more experiences, which means when you have to think of a creative solution, you're just going to have more raw material of ideas to work with, right? So even that one is reversible, if you will. But it's about as close as you can come. Now, that's a far cry from the world we live in, where some people declare them. Like, here's what really, no offense to your field especially, but here's what really bugged me is you remember about 10, 15 years ago when it became really trendy to call yourself a creative? Like creative it just used to be an adjective. And now it's sort of like, oh, I'm so-and-so, I'm a creative. What does that mean? Like you're treating that like you're some priest of a Near Eastern mysticism religion or something like that. You're a creative. I'm a Buddhist. I don't get it at all. Because the truth is, it's just a question of how well you practice it, how many times you flex that muscle.
So true. I've spoken at so many conferences where someone will come up to me afterwards and say, well, Phil, totally agree with what you say, but I'm just not a creative person. I wasn't born creative, so it really doesn't apply to me. And I'm just stunned at the number of people that really believe that. I like your kids, I will say, put a bunch of toddlers in a room together. You don't look at them and go, that guy's not creative. He's going to be an accountant or he's going to be an attorney or something. Everybody's born wildly creative. So the idea that we lose it. Now, I've heard, it's interesting, you said fourth grade. I've heard that around as early as first grade, whatever the age is, there's something wrong with our educational system that makes us start to lose creativity when we start going to school. I think that's something that needs to be looked into in a pretty significant way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And there's a lot of folks like Sir Ken Robinson was big on that idea, right? That there's something about the remember and regurgitate facts. This is the right way to do certain things, right? One of my colleagues, Kathy Goff, always used to joke that like, it's the way we teach math, right? Like if I tell you what is 1 and 1, you'll say 2. But actually, if you take 1 and 1, it could be 11. It depends on the frame of mind you're in, right? And granted, 1 plus 1 is always 2. Like this isn't some weird Common Core thing. But what I mean by that is depending on how we frame it, right? And so I think what happens is kids, especially the really conscientious kids, the really ones who actually sort of want to get ahead and get that A, et cetera, learn that their value is in memorizing and regurgitating something back instead of creating something new, which is it's a lot harder to grade, et cetera. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't have the answers. Part of the reason I taught college and grad school is that it's a whole lot easier to figure out how to get those people to unlearn all of that muck than to learn how to not get the muck on them in the first place. I wish I had those answers, but I really don't.
Well, it's so true. And it's like a muscle. I just feel like I tell people that, look, you got to use it. You can't, obviously, you're not going to be creative if you just sit around watching TV all day. You've actually got to be out there coming up with ideas, doing stuff. I even tell people, drive home a different way, dress a different way, go meet some new friends. Your comment about exposing yourself to new ideas, I think is so, and experiences are so critical to people. So, all right, let me do a third one and I'll quit on that but there's a whole list on here, trust me, that are fantastic. But let me do the third one. The third myth is the constraints myth. Orson Welles, possibly, directed the greatest film in history, Citizen Kane, said the absence of limitations is the enemy of creativity. And yet most people think if you'll just leave me alone, if I can have an unlimited budget, unlimited time schedule, I can be more creative. Tell me why that's a myth.
Yeah, it's funny. We've studied this in the lab with, like, for one of my favorite tests of it. Well, you give someone a blank piece of paper and you say, draw me a picture, and they stare at it for minutes and sometimes, 10, 15 minutes before they decide what to draw. And then they draw and it looks terrible. If you give them like just a right angle on a line and say, draw a picture out of this, they'll actually end up with something way more creative because they've got that little bit of a starting point. And constraints are sort of that for us. The best way I've ever heard it described is constraints help us understand the problem we're trying to solve. Right. Constraints are like, and it's weird because it's sort of like we then use that term, think outside of the box. Like, no, let's actually figure out exactly how big the box is because we need to get inside of it with our solution. They actually help us, especially if we're going to freewheel and come up with all sorts of different ideas. Constraints help us sift through those ideas and arrive at the few and make that transition in a convergent thinking we were talking about earlier. So from a psychological standpoint, whether it's in the lab or in practice, constraints actually help us generate ideas and also sift through those ideas. Now, the irony of all of this is that I said in a lab, in reality, there is no problem without a set of constraints. Like there will never be. That's probably why it's called ideas on a deadline, right? There will always be deadlines. And you and I probably both have that friend that's trying to write that book or trying to write that film that has zero constraints. And as a result, they've made zero progress on it, right? In my world, in writing, the smartest thing publishers ever do is they give you an advance and a deadline. And most of the time I end up spending the money of the advance. So I better hit that deadline.
Well, it's interesting here in Hollywood. Whenever a studio gives a director an unlimited budget or an unlimited schedule, the movie always fails. It's just, I mean, you can just count on it. The movie will always fail. So there's no question that, I tell people I don't even start working on a project until I see the deadline looming in the distance. There's something that gets my blood pumping and it does give you a roadmap. That's a great, it gives you a roadmap to really gauge what you're doing.
Yeah, and you said Citizen Kane, but one of my favorite examples from the world of sort of Hollywood is I'm a big sort of action movie buff. I can't when I'm on planes and things, I can't get my mind to function to do work. I have to watch comedies or action movies. But I think it was El Mariachi, the Mexican gunslinging movie. That whole thing was filmed on a budget of like $250,000. The guy had to borrow guns from friends of his that owned guns and borrow this car and all of this stuff. But it's such an amazing and creative movie almost as a result of those constraints. Meanwhile, you've got like Fast and the Furious 19, where there's an unlimited budget and people are like car chase, explosion, Rock with his shirt off, boom, let's send it to post-production. And they're terrible.
Yeah, they're terrible every time. And it's just interesting what constraints force you to do. And usually they force you to do better than you would have otherwise. I certainly, I demand deadlines. I have to have them. And now we always have budget in my world. We always have a budget we have to deal with. But so let me just say, this is just 3 of the many myths of creativity that you deal with in your book. And I just encourage people, the truth about how innovative companies and people generate great ideas. It's a terrific book, and I'd encourage people to get it. But I want to switch gears. Let's switch gears now. Coming out of the pandemic, it's been, a couple of years now. We're leading teams from all over the place. And your book, Leading from Anywhere, again, man, really hit a sweet spot with me, because even though there's a rush to get people back into the building, Elon Musk is trying to get everybody back to Twitter. Tim Cooke is trying to get everybody back to Apple. And I've got a neighbor who runs post-production at Sony Studios here in Hollywood, and he's lucky to get people back 3 days a week, but he's doing his best to get people back. However, I think certain jobs are going to be remote forever. I sent like I said earlier, I sent my team home, and they're all over the country. And no matter what we do, I'm going to always be dealing with them from there. So tell me a little bit about the impetus for writing the book, Leading from Anywhere, and why it's so important in this moment of time that we live in now.
Yeah. So on a personal note, the through line through all of my work is usually teams, right? So one of the other myths in the myth of creativity is the lone creator myth. I think that's bunk. Creativity is a team sport. And so I also study how teams operate, et cetera. And obviously everybody was thrown kind of this major wrench in their works by COVID and by this idea that, I'm naive enough. I remember a time when I thought everybody was going to go home for like a 2-week workcation, right? You remember this? And then we'd all kind of be back. And then 15 days turned into 30 days to slow the spread, turned into 60 days. I remember when they took it off and from the White House, it just moved from 60 days to slow the spread to slow the spread. And that's when people started asking me questions about when are we going back and how are we going to come back, et cetera. And what I told them is we're not. At least not all of us and not all of the time. I think there is value to having people in person. I'm sure you have to when you're in production, et cetera, bring your team together in person. There's also value in time away to do deep work, et cetera. But the truth is what people got was about a 18 months to 2 year long. I live in Oklahoma, so it was really only like 6 months. But I got a multi-year experience of what it is to have autonomy over your schedule. And they're not going to give that up willingly, right? And that's actually, I think, the biggest little secret of where we are right now. It's not actually about remote. It's about autonomy and about flexibility and letting people do the calendar that they want to do. Some are going to want to come back 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Some are going to want to come back never. And even if everyone came back, let's say Tim Cooke gets what he wants and everything, the fact that we've spent 2 years learning all of these virtual collaboration tools creates a massive opportunity, which is that we know how to collaborate with people across time zones and across cultures in a way we maybe didn't before. So now we're working to put together a project. And this is the other shift, and I've yet to write anything about this, but this is the other shift, by the way. I think most of us are moving from salary-based work to project-based work, not unlike how Hollywood, works. But as we look to put together a project, we can do it based on who the best people for the team are, regardless of where they are. So none of us are going to escape having to collaborate with people in a virtual environment or a remote environment, even if it's 2 people in an office, but one's in Cleveland and one's in Burbank, right? That we're still going to be using these tools of virtual collaboration. So I felt like it was really important to go, okay, maybe you didn't ask for this. Maybe this wasn't one of the types of teams you wanted to learn, but what do you need to know about how teams can collaborate best in this environment and what you need to do as their leader? So that was sort of the impetus for the book. It was obviously driven by the pandemic. Sometimes there's what you want to create, and then there's what the world starts asking for. And this was definitely an asking for.
So is there anything in that process, in your research, in your study, that you encountered that you didn't expect? Give me some of the thoughts about, okay, how am I going to improve my leadership skills with my team working remotely?
Yeah. So, once you kind of embrace the idea that the team's not coming back entirely. The next question I got asked from most leaders was, what happens to our culture? How do we stay connected? How do we build bonds if we're not there together, if we're all just pixels on a screen instead of real people, right? And when you look at the research there, especially what I call the BC, the before Corona research, you find 3 elements are hugely important. How well a team has a sense of shared understanding, shared identity, and psychological safety. Shared understanding is how well the team has clarity on their tasks. They know what's been assigned of them. They know who's working on what. They know what to expect from other people. They know how it all fits in together. But it's also clarity of person, how well we understand each other's personalities. Who is really that long talker that would prefer to jump on a phone call, and who is the person that thinks as they write, and so they're going to write you their long emails instead. As we understand those little differences, we're better able to collaborate with each other. Shared identity is what we do to make us still feel like we're one cohesive team, right? There was a lot of culture and identity that we relied on being physically in the same space for that we can't really have anymore. So it's the little, the rituals that we develop, the way in which maybe we level the playing field and make people feel like you're important no matter what time zone you're in, even if the boss is in this time zone. All of that is shared identity. To answer your question on the most surprising, it was probably psychological safety. Now, from an academic standpoint and research on teams going back probably 40 years, psychological safety has never not been important. And psych safety is the extent to which people feel safe to take risks, to speak up when they disagree. Like, this is hugely important to creativity, because if people don't agree, if there's no friction, we're not going to generate our best ideas. And so we need to build a place where people feel safe for that. Now, that's different than a safe space, right?
Yes,
There are actually no safe there's no safe spaces. There's just safe people. And psychological safety is whether or not people feel safe around other people to express that disagreement and still be respected. Here's what was surprising. That's important in every type of team. What I wasn't counting on is how much more difficult it is to build in a remote environment. Like, it's hard to speak up on a Zoom call. You were saying it's hard to be that person in a conference room where a bunch of people are being loud and you've got this idea. It's harder to do that when you've got the Brady Bunch grid of faces on a Zoom call, right? It's hard to notice if you're facilitating that meeting. It's hard to notice that one person who's like, because they disagree, especially if you got bandwidth problems and that sort of stuff. So it becomes even more important for leaders to not assume consensus when we're discussing things, to actively ask for conflict and disagreement in a structured way, and then to respond when people speak up against them or disagree with them, to respond in a way that conveys respect and trust, and that, hey, I want to hash out this difference respectfully so that we're both better as a result of it. It's harder to do that in a virtual environment, which means we have to do it much more often than we may have felt like we had to do when we were in person.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a question for you. I've noticed something weird coming out of COVID. You can't say a generation, but millions of young people came out of college or high school, and they started their career remotely because of COVID. And they spent, in many places, certainly California, New York, other places, went 2 years pretty much that way. In fact, here in California, it's still going on to a great degree. So they started their career, the first two, when I started my career, the first 2 years, I learned an enormous amount about how to get along with other people, office etiquette, how to conduct yourself in a meeting. And suddenly I'm going to meetings now that have younger people in it that started their career during COVID remotely, and they're coming back to the office. They have no clue about how to listen. They have no clue about how to conduct themselves in a meeting. Is it because I'm an old guy, or is it just, is there really something out there?
No, I mean, they learned how to do it via Zoom, and they're probably really good at running a Zoom meeting, but not so much that. And you know what's funny is what I'm finding, at least, and this is more anecdotal than hard data, because I don't even know how you would structure a study on this. But I worked with, I think, 54 different companies so far this year, right, on this issue. And what I've noticed is there's kind of a bifurcation in who wants to come back, right? Okay. Luckily, those young folks want to be back in the office. Maybe not every day, but they want to be back because I think they get that they're missing that. Maybe not the mentoring, but they get that they're missing the FaceTime. They get that they're missing mentoring. They want the mentoring. They don't want the correction, maybe, but they get that they're missing that. And then the older folks like you, are actually like, yeah, I want to be back, mostly because, like, home is boring, right? There's no kids there. There's no what have you. It's actually, it's my age folks, right? I'm just about to turn 40 with 2 kids at home, working. Both of us work, right? We're the ones that are like, please, I need some flexibility to juggle all of this stuff, right? And so what I think is going to happen, and again, this is anecdotal, is actually a really interesting generational shift where there's sort of going to be a bigger gap in mentoring than we've ever seen before. It's the folks that came back first because they're in the older generation, and the folks that came back first because they're younger that are going to be pairing up. And I'm actually most worried about your sort of late Gen X, early millennial, so like your 35 to 45 or so folks, because we're the ones pushing for flexibility because we're drowning in the day-to-day without the long-term vision of, like, these are the folks that are going to get all of the mentoring and all of the coaching. And long-term, I'm less worried about it, right? Okay. Now, that said, I mean, I would tell a younger person who wants to be working from home probably the exact same thing it sounds like you would tell them, which is, get back 2 or 3 times a week, because you need to be top of mind. And there's little things that aren't in a manual, unless you were like, you went to the best MBA programs that actually had business etiquette and communications classes and that sort of stuff. But most of them don't have that. They have finance and accounting and marketing courses and not that kind of personal stuff. But even through all of COVID, we proved we're still in the business of people. All of us are.
Well, I did see a report in Wall Street Journal a few months ago that indicated that getting FaceTime with a boss, getting into meetings, those do matter. In fact, I have a friend who's a high-level executive with LinkedIn, and he told me that he's noticed people who onboarded during the pandemic, ones that have come in, they've onboarded in the office versus onboarding remotely. He said the ones that have onboarded at the office are far ahead of the people that onboarded remotely. They're just doing better because the boss sees them every day. They're listening to their ideas. They're engaging with people. So there is something to coming back. I think it is going to be critical for people.
Yeah. And that's why I said earlier, I think for most organizations, the problem isn't how remote are we or what have you. It's that what people really want is the autonomy to decide when they're coming back. Most of them want to be back, at least a little bit, right? Yeah. Whether that's based on the business, that might be a couple of days a week. A business like Cooke Media Group, that's going to be we come back for projects and then we go our separate ways. But they want that time. They just don't want as much of it as they had before. And you know what? I don't know that I disagree with that either, because there's a reason Dilbert and The Office and Office Space were like the super popular movies and TV shows pre-COVID, because most of us were sitting around the office going, why are we here for 40 hours a week? It only takes like 20 to do what I'm tasked with doing.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Well, and I'm just fascinated by the behavior. I taught a class not long ago in a university. It was a graduate program, and it was in the round. And I'm sitting there teaching, and I'm walking around while I'm teaching. And I noticed one kid was really into I say kid, but he's in his mid to late 20s, his grad program. He was really into his computer. And I thought, I'm not saying anything that smart. He's not making that many notes. And so as I taught, I just kind of wandered around because it was in the round, and I walked around behind him, and he was playing a video game. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing to me was he made no attempt to cover it up. He knew I was standing there watching. He made no attempt to hide it at all. So I stopped the class and I brought it up. I said, okay, you're paying a lot of money at a graduate level institution to take this class. And I said, you're about to enter your career, and you choose to play a video game instead of, making notes about the class. And he said, why not? He said, I have a right to do what I want to do. If I choose to do that, what's the problem with that? And the interesting thing to me is most of the people in the class agreed with him. And I just thought, whoa, that's a little different experience. So he's paying a graduate school program to play a video game. And, it wasn't a hostile conversation at all. It was really enlightening to me that he felt perfectly comfortable. In my day in school, I'd have hidden that, I'd have been hiding like crazy, or hiding that comic book in the textbook, whatever it was. But he felt perfectly fine that why not? So it's an interesting psychological makeup between kids entering school or career now.
Yeah. And I don't know, it's interesting because we both dabble in the academic world, but mostly target sort of practitioners, right? Because somebody who paid tens of thousands of dollars to be a part of, like, when to bring me in to do a workshop or something like that wouldn't necessarily do that. I think the interesting thing, if I may, this is totally unrelated to remote or what have you. I think universities really sort of adopted this idea that the student is the customer. Started maybe about 20 years ago, really came to its heyday about 5 or 6 years ago. And then especially in the area of COVID, I mean, every university was just desperate to keep whatever students they had. And we still have nationally in the United States, it's still something like 1.5 million college students who dropped off during COVID have yet to return, right? Wow. So there was this kind of customer idea, but I had a little bit different mentality. One of my opening, the first day of class, you're going over the syllabus and what have you. One of the things I would always tell them is, now you may be tempted to believe that I'm delivering a service and that you are a customer. I don't see it that way. I do have a customer. My customer is you 5 years from now. Right. In other words, you're the product. I'm trying to turn you into what you will be proud to be 5 years from now. That's the sort of way I see it. And if you don't disagree with that, that's going to cause a lot of our tensions. Right. So now that said, I still may have kids who played video games and hit it well in the class. But it was one of the things I tried to establish, because I think that's probably where we're headed in a lot of higher ed. And that's going to create some problems moving forward inside of organizations as well.
Cool. All right. Last question. You spent your career working with teams, leading teams, helping companies understand how to make their teams perform more effectively. In my world, and most of the people listening to this, I would say, are professional creative people. They may be writers, producers.
Did I insult them all when I said, please don't call yourself a creative anymore?
No.
Okay.
Look,
Thanks
I'm
if
all
you're
for
still
that.
listening.
I'm all for that. Trust me. It's like, it's like the word content. I spend my life knocking myself out trying to create a film, and somebody calls that content. It's not content. It's a film that I busted my butt for. It's just interesting how people view this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not a content creator. Anyway, no matter how creative somebody may be as a designer, a writer, an actor, whatever, if they move up the ladder, which most of them will, they're going to have to lead teams. And while there's a ton of leadership expertise out there and great teaching from guys like you, guys like John Maxwell, other people, when it comes to leading creative people, give me a couple tips on chemistry, how to inspire them. Give me just a couple last thoughts about leading. What would you say are some of the important things to consider when leading creative people?
Yeah. So, I think when you've got, my friend Todd Henry uses this term herding tigers, which is a brilliant.
And I love that book.
Right. And if you think about that metaphor, I think teaching them how to do that psychological safety piece is probably the first thing I'd say of two ideas for you. Teaching them how to fight right. You're going to have fights. The issue with creative, with people in the creative industries is that we get really attached to our idea. I submitted this idea to the group. It was my idea. And therefore, if you criticize the idea, you're criticizing me, right? Yeah. And you get to a certain level of maturity in your career, in whatever it is, if you're in any creative industry, where you stop doing that. But especially in the early days, you start to associate your idea. You get territorial over it. The truth is, ideas are babies, and some of them are cute and some of them are ugly, but all of them need time to grow and develop and be nurtured into something great, right? And if you don't teach your team how to fight right, everybody's going to feel like you just called my baby ugly, right? So that's number one, is build that psychological safety, teach them how to fight right, and model the way. Christine Porath, probably the world's foremost researcher on civility in the workplace, says the number one reason people give for why they have an uncivil workplace is lack of demonstration of it from leaders, right? So you model the way of how to have those civil fights. Wow. Now, the second thing would be in and around purpose and what you do to remind people why we're doing what we're doing. In fact, I actually think why is the wrong word. No offense to people who've made their whole career over why. I agree with why. I think that why needs to be answered with who, as in who is served by the work that we're doing. And sometimes the role of a leader is to kind of be the chief storytelling officer, to tell that team on a regular basis, this is who we're impacting when we do this work. This is how we're changing the world down to a specific level. If you want to get nerdy, this is usually referred to as pro-social motivation or pro-social purpose. I just like to think of it as who. Keep that at the forefront of the team's mind on a regular basis. This is who is served by the work that we're doing. And ironically, that puts a lot of these petty little fights in a totally different perspective as well. So teach them to fight right, but also teach them who they're doing all of that work for.
I like that idea of purpose. I was meeting with a nonprofit in New Orleans the other day, and it's funded by a guy who owns a chain of car dealerships all over the country. Very successful car guy, automotive guy. And he wanted to give his car guys a bigger sense of purpose. So they launched a big nonprofit in New Orleans called Giving Hope. And it's a food bank. It's a community center. They do all kind of work all over New Orleans. And it was so interesting when I went to meet with the nonprofit leaders, half the people were car salesmen. And it's because they were so excited about having this purpose beyond just selling cars. And they were popping off ideas like, well, what if every time we sold a car, what if we had a garbage bag, a grocery bag that we gave to the person, and we took our picture with them and we said, this is going to be a grocery bag filled with stuff for a needy family because you bought this car. And they were popping off all kinds of ideas. And I just thought, what a great idea that purpose is so much more important. You may sell plumbing supplies or cars or insurance or whatever, but having a bigger overarching purpose for what you do really does inspire people. I was just amazed at how excited those car salesmen got over that sense of purpose with Giving Hope. It was amazing.
Yeah. And I would argue it's because they brought it down to that personal level, right? There's a specific family that's going to get that bag. We internalize this and we hear it from the Maxwells of the world, et cetera. And we think, oh my gosh, I need to rewrite our vision statement. It's not big enough. Like, how many times have you dealt with an organization that we need a bigger vision? We need a bigger vision. No, you probably don't, because most people aren't motivated by that. Like, most of them have no idea what your mission statement is anyway. Like, let's just be honest. They couldn't regurgitate it if you forced them to, right? But second of all, they don't know how that ties into their day-to-day work, right? So that idea of let's draw a thick black line between selling a car and feeding a family. And now all of those people who sell the car know this is why I do it. Yeah, I mean, I get paid and whatever, but now I have this other who that benefits. And that's way more important than whatever blah, 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 premier car dealership in the American Southwest, blah, blah, innovation, integrity.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Totally. Yeah, I saw a Christian conference recently called the Shake the Nations Conference. And at the end of the conference, I doubt any nations were shook. So I totally agree with you. A
small one like Tuvalu. Yeah.
Sometimes I think we think way too big instead of really getting it down to the single person. Well, tell me, okay, to find out more about you, David Burkus, what do we do?
It was actually really easy. I was blessed with a really rare name. So if you type David Burkus into Google or DuckDuckGo or what have you, you're going to find me, which is great. There was at one point this one guy who was the webmaster for like his Elks Lodge in Indiana. But I think I have finally beat him in the Google rankings. So you're going to find me on whatever socials you want, my website, but also LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter. I don't do TikTok just because I don't dance, but any of the other ones to keep this conversation going. And I hope you do, because, we had a great time chatting, Phil, but if you're listening to this and you've got questions, et cetera, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any of those questions.
I understand. There's a Phil Cooke who was a detective in Northern California, and he always would pop up because he did these high profile crimes, and then he got arrested for corruption. So I don't have that competition anymore. So that worked out.
But that's rough. A name like Phil Cooke, that's rough. Can I make a recommendation? Phil Burkus? I mean, it would be, it's probably available.
That's great. Well, listen, thank you so much. This has been fantastic, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do it. And we may have to do a part 2 sometime soon. I just want to thank David for being a guest today. This has been so enlightening. I'm always fascinated with creativity and the myths. Understanding what's wrong about creativity is amazing. And also his book about, leading from anywhere is fantastic. Being able to lead your team during this remote world that we live in. And although we're seeing more and more people go back to the office, we're also seeing that remote work is here to stay for many, many people on your team. I know our team is in Los Angeles, it's in Kansas City, it's in Tulsa, it's in Greenville, South Carolina. It's in Florida. We have members all over the country. And so leading what I do and our creative team is so critical. And I've learned so much from David. Remember, we love your giving us a rating, recommending us to your friends. It really helps us get seen by more people and get this information out there in a big way. And don't forget, while you're on this subject, get my book, Ideas on a Deadline, How to Be Creative When the Clock is Ticking. I'll tell you, this, accompanied by Dave's book, The Myths of Creativity, will really start a creative library in your office or your home. I think these are the kind of resources you need to really take your life to the next level. Donate. We appreciate your financial support, helping us make this happen. We're not sponsored by anybody at this point, at least. And we'd love for someone to step up and help sponsor this. And until then, we appreciate your financial support for everything we do. Stay tuned, and we'll see you next time.